coming to our third and final presentation of this three-part series for the climate element. And the last topic we are going to cover is heat. So for today's agenda, we have welcome and introductions. We'll go over the purpose and goals of the workshop today. We'll do a presentation on heat, as well as facilitate a discussion with our attendees in the room on heat and do a wrap up, as Emily mentioned. All right, so for those of us who are at the table, would we like to go around and introduce ourselves and say your name and maybe what organization you are with?
John Roberts. I'm on Cascade Custom Homes here on Whidbey Island, and I brought my daughter, Lindsay, who just graduated from WSU with a degree in landscape architecture. So this was something that we've had numerous conversations about. So I said, asked Emily if it'd be great for her to sit here and get some input. So
Cool.
we come as a team.
Awesome.
I'm Jill Cuddy. I represent the Marine Resources Committee. And Barbara Bennett has been at one of the previous workshops, as Frank Easton. We chose people at different workshops, so you get like the breadth of the Marine Resources Committee. Fabulous.
Yeah, I'm John Murphy, representing Whidbey Island Water Systems Association, which the board all has day jobs. So,
It's Wayne Kreider, I'm the Executive Director of the Skagit Island County Builders Association.
I'm Marty Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of Whidbey Environmental Action Network.
I'm Ann Tierce. I'm with Whidbey Climate Action.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Tyhouse. I'm the Planning Liaison Officer for Naval Air Station Whidbey Island.
Christina Hines, the Executive Director of Economic Development Council for Island County.
I'm Kevin Dunham. I'm here on behalf of the Ag Resource Committee for Island County.
And I will ask, the room is kind of echoey, so if you can try to project your voice when you're talking at the tables, the folks back in here. And if anybody is having a hard time hearing, we welcome you to drag your chair around the edges. That's perfectly fine too if you're struggling to hear.
All right, so each of these workshops, we've had a little mix of different people. So every time we go over the purpose and goal of these workshops. So the purpose of these workshops is to help inform the climate element, which I'll also discuss a little bit in the next slide. But essentially for the climate element, we are beginning to write policies to address climate resiliency for Island County. So we want input from the public and people who are professionals in this space, who know Island County intimately, to help us prioritize recommended actions and goals. So that's why we're here today. The goal of this meeting is to focus on specific climate hazards and understand the depth of knowledge that we have in the room to share with us to help us develop those policies, make sure they're in line with Island County priorities. So what is the climate element? The climate element is a new requirement for the comprehensive plan update. These are brand new for the entire state, but the climate element requires this resiliency sub-element, which focuses on creating more resilient Island County to impending climate hazards. So the resiliency sub-element has three different requirements. First, it must address natural hazards created or aggravated by climate change, which we'll discuss how different climate hazards have compounding hazards associated with them, to identify, protect, and enhance natural areas. So that's ecosystem services. And then 3, identify and protect and enhance community resilience. So that's more social and infrastructural focused. Here's an overview of the process. So what we've done to date is our team has assessed the impending impacts based on data, as well as assessed current plans that Island County has to address these things. So essentially, we're trying to identify vulnerabilities to climate change, as well as identifying gaps in policy. What kind of policies exist? Where is there need for more policy, or where policies maybe aren't working and need to change? So now we're at the phase where we are establishing goals and policies, which we hope that the input we receive from these workshops will help to inform that. All right, and now we are going to present on heat, which John will be.
Hi, everyone. My name is John Phillips. I work for Parametrics. I've met a lot of you already. I'll reintroduce myself. Sorry, at the last minute. Some people didn't have the same idea of timing as I did on the way in. It's actually raining really hard. Really slow going through Skagit Valley. We're going to talk a little bit about heat today. We kind of already talked about sea level rise last week. Earlier this week, we did a discussion on change in precipitation. One of the things, the message we heard is that kind of like it's happening now. Please think about this more in the short term and long term. We heard that loud and clear. The other thing I want to talk about when we talk about these impacts of this hazard, we want to talk about the compound effects. So not just that it's getting warmer, but what happens now. Now, that's kind of interesting to say when you talk about climate change, is that's why we're seeing it, because the planet is heating up. So we see these impacts. When we specifically talk about heat, we want to talk about the heat factors that might impact the community and have influence on how we look at the comp plan with the staff. You all sitting around the table. So I want to hit the next slide. Annual heat projections. What we are going to see is just the increasing amount of days of extreme heat. Extreme heat is the temperatures over 90 degrees. 90 degrees is specific to the Pacific Northwest, is specific to Western Washington. So we don't compare ourselves to other places where it's much hotter. We don't compare ourselves to places where it's much. Very specifically, 90 degrees is the kind of trigger point here in the Pacific Northwest. Do I really have to tell you that 90 degrees is hot? Because we all know it. We're up from here, woo, we're down at 90 degrees. Just one that I was thinking about this when I relate a little story, is I do service projects all over the country every once in a while. So 85 degrees in New Orleans is much different than 85 degrees in the Pacific. So that's when we differentiate. That's when we be very specific. Talk about the impacts here in the Pacific Northwest. But also realize that people are living in much warmer temperatures in other places in the world, and that gives us some sense of what we can do and what we understand. There's a lot of research on heat going on right now. It's probably once, twice a week, I'll see papers coming out about how the human body reacts to heat. So when we're talking about heat, we're talking about us, people, what we have to do in that heat, but also realizing that there's a lot more impacts on around us. The consensus right now is that the Earth's temperature, global averages will go up 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2030. That just came out from the International Panel on Climate Change. Based on all the new climate model that they've been doing, we're basically staring down the barrel. What does that mean? If you can remember 2015 here in Western Washington, that was a year where the global temperature 1.5 degrees Celsius across the average based on the solar. Look at the 20%. We kind of see what the future might hold, which is a lot of things we'll be talking about. The other part of temperature is not just the 90 degrees during the day, it's the temperature at night. What happens is if your body doesn't get a chance to cool, physiologically, you're still under stress of heat. So if you're in your house and you're trying to sleep and it's 66 degrees, that's causing heat-related stress. So when we have both the 90 degrees during the day, we also look at the nighttime. Is it cooling off the night to cool off the people so they can have that chance for their body to recover? And that's something we see in the public health book. Now, obviously, there's lots of great ways to mitigate that. Western facing windows, so you get that 90 degrees if it's out there. Freezes in a while. But also, right, air conditioning, things like that. Again, it's going up mid-century. Everything's kind of increasing. We used to see number of days, this number of days in the summer where it was less than 65, we're going to see a few more. Next slide. So here we're going to talk about a few things. We did a lot of discussion on drought on Tuesday. We'll talk about the increased fire risk, but a little bit more about increased fire risk based on heat, and also talk a little bit about the smoke influences, right? May not be a wildfire right here in Island County, in Island, Whidbey Island, could be a wildfire in British Columbia, could be wildfires down south, could be wildfires out in eastern Washington, where smoke becomes the number one issue, right? Where we have to kind of close up and stay at home. And if there's people that have sensitivities, people with asthma, COPD, things like that, they're also under a lot of stress because now they have to think about not being outside, not being able to open their windows, go out, those types of things. So those are some of the compounding hazards. And with all that warm air, that increases the amount of moisture in the atmosphere. And that's why we see some of these quote unquote atmospheric rivers with a warm cycle of water coming to hit somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide. So impacts to seniors. Folks that are a little bit older. The heat is a stress indicator for anybody over 65, healthy or unhealthy, over 65, they do see that as a stress indicator. Honestly, I'm almost there. Heat's a stress indicator for me too. This last summer, I was at a cooling center in my backyard. We were doing yard work. But that's something we want to look at, and that's something we looked at as far as where that pattern is on Island County. So understanding kind of the social impacts and kind of looking at where those areas are in comparison to where they are on the island. They're on the leeward side of the island. Also, like how much of the area have tree canopy, how much of the area has impervious surface. Areas that are impervious without a lot of trees tend to heat up and be hotter than areas where there's trees and other things to kind of keep it cool and shaded. So the temperature in the shade is different than the temperature standing out in the middle of the sidewalk. Next slide. And then the pre-existing health conditions. So that was like asthma, COPD, diabetes. These are all information we collect from the CDC. We don't have any kind of go out and do these surveys. We're going to see what the CDC is saying about the health of Island County, where there might be chronic diseases. Those then exacerbate health effects when you have high temperatures. That increases the number of heat-related illnesses. And an interesting fact from Washington State Department of Health is since 2017, they've seen a marked increase in the number of heat-related illnesses around Washington State. I was looking to see if they broke it down by county, and they haven't quite broken it down by county, but there are a number of deaths and heat-related illnesses reported at hospitals in the last 5 to 6 years. The impact of agriculture and our agricultural system the same way. One of the things is it's getting warmer, so longer growing season, yay, but longer growing season, maybe get berries in May instead of having to wait till June or July, but also increased need for water to irrigate kind of later in the season. It's something to think about. Also, we look at this from the impact to the workers too. The people that have to go out there and harvest all that food, to be out there kind of in the agricultural field without a lot of shade and have temperature issues. And we see that. We see that in the summertime if you drive through Scatman Valley, you see the people out there harvesting berries, you start to see tents popping up along the fields, right? Because they still have to harvest the food in a lot calmer temperature. They're doing physical labor when it's 85, 90 degrees. That has an impact on how fast they can work, how long they can work, to make sure they're safe. Also, your public works employees, places, people that have to work out in the field, contractors, construction workers, have to think about that once it starts getting warmer. We shift our times around and look at different times to work, making sure there's places for people to cool down and take breaks. And then how does it kind of affect the overall ecosystem? Well, our ecosystem is used to the temperatures that we're used to in the Northwest. So anything that happens to us is going to happen to shelters, happen to our fish, our streams that carry the salmon are going to be warmer over time. Water is heating up. The oceans are getting warmer, so they'll all have the compounded impact of impacting the way we look at shelter. Or the way we look at the ecosystem as far as food supply. Stream temperatures will get warmer in the future. There's a lot of efforts going on and working in Washington to look at that broadly to kind of figure out how do we keep those stream temperatures down. So habitat to go into, not just the habitat. The whole toilet, also habitat as far as temperature. That's something to think about. Also compounding that, and we kind of brought it up in Island County's kind of risk, is you have a major asset here in Island County of shellfish industry. Not only is heat an issue, but also we wanted to point out that there's ocean acidification. So because there's more CO2 in the ocean becomes more acidic, and that's impacting the way the shellfish grow. So we put that as a risk especially from an economic perspective. That's the world's best shellfish coming out of just over here in Penn Cove. Make sure we understand that that's a risk economy and to your needs. And then impacts to infrastructure. I mentioned the workers themselves, but actually to the roads. These are road buckings that happen in Washington City. We look around and see that when it gets really warm, roads start to buckle. Runways start to buckle also. Another little thing to think about. As it gets warmer, these things start to shift. That actually causes damage. We've been talking a lot about this with Washington State Department of Transportation and Oregon Department of Transportation, and really looking at how roads are constructed in Arizona and Nevada to understand what they're doing, because they're experiencing that on a regular basis. So everybody's kind of on a high alert. These roads will be bumped as it gets warmer. You see that. You'll already see it here. Now, for the table, questions about what went over fairly quickly. Anything you wanted to kind of add to the story?
I appreciated you bringing up rising temperatures in streams, and that's something that came to our county's attention in March when there was a presentation to the board about, I believe 50% of the tested streams in Allen County were in poor health, and a major indicator of poor health was rising stream temperatures. And at that time, I remember hearing our board talk about the urgency to address that issue with increasing vegetation, increasing vegetated buffers, doing planting. And there was a real sense in the room of a shared desire to do something about it. But that was almost 8 months ago, and it was the hottest year on record in 175 years in the Northern Hemisphere. And I don't see outcomes from the county in terms of changing policy, changing budgetary allocations, changing staffing to jump at that kind of issue when we see it. And so I guess my question is, how can policy suggest the urgency that's required and actually guide action instead of just awareness?
Yes.
I had a question. When you were talking about that warmer temperatures carrying more moisture in the air, we're also talking about summer humidity, aren't we? It's not just atmospheric rivers, but
Potentially, but what happens, what we see, I've been talking to the UW folks about this a little bit, there's a lot of things happening in the atmosphere that for the Pacific Northwest are kind of different than other places. Yes, we might see more humidity, but also it will be drier in August, September. So overall, there's more moisture in the atmosphere, but all of a sudden, what I want to find, what they're looking at is how the jet streams change and where that water actually goes. Does that water actually, I mean, we've seen some summertime storms in Southern California and Arizona that they don't normally see. So what's happening kind of globally where the ships go. In the wintertime, we tend to get these little streams of atmospheric rivers, and they're pretty much saying that's a winter event, see those atmospheric rivers, in winter being a kind of a long season, October to May. And then it starts getting really warm and dry up in the Pacific Northwest. So while they'll probably have a study out in the next few years about how that's shifting, because there's different ocean interactions happening with the currents and also with the jet stream. Because the ocean's now getting warmer, is it pushing the jet stream in different directions during the summertime where we didn't see as much precipitation. And I don't know if we're going to be like super humid. Like I don't think it's going to be tropical humidity here in the Pacific Northwest. We're in the desert still, so there's going to be kind of that drier feeling of it.
because I mean, this summer we're feeling a lot more humidity as it was, but so we're not worried about wet bulb temperatures and how.
Well, the
that
actual
affects
temperatures
the
are considered wet bulb humidex, so it's called the wet bulb, right? So it's the 90 degrees total temperature, including humidity. And so that is increasing, but I haven't heard anyone say like, oh, we're going to have, like subtropical humidity here in the Pacific Northwest. It is kind of damp anyway, so yes, you'll feel humidity in different areas. But overall, it's a drier area. Not a great explanation.
I appreciated your emphasis on trying to keep up with the literature and really trying to, there's many articles that are coming out with related issues. I brought you one, and it's about how common medications make people more vulnerable to heat. And these are the medications that treat the diseases that you talked about there, like diabetes, but also mental health diseases. And it's fairly common medications, and they make you more susceptible to heat. So there's a copy here. I also appreciated Marnie's point about the how something we raise here might be translated into a policy that goes into effect this summer, like that has some urgency to it. And one of the things which would be very easy for the county to do is to allow flex time for their workers that work outside in heat. Pretty easy to do that, just flex their time, and something you could enact tomorrow.
So can I address with regards to that?
Sure.
Department of Labor and Industries already regulates fairly stringent piece to that. So the county, to some extent, to my knowledge, as well as any private enterprise, must be already working underneath that.
Except that, can I jump in? Except that what the labor and industry has done is to base their policies on the past. And we can no longer use the past to predict the future. We have to base our decisions about projections. And so at the state level, they're a little slow in working towards these projections, but I think the county can leapfrog over that.
Any other questions from the? Okay.
Great. Okay, so this is the phase of the workshop where we dive into a discussion. So everybody has sticky notes in front of them. Those of you who are in the audience viewing can also participate here. We have a bunch of sticky notes. What we want you to do is to answer the following questions, and please write as many ideas that you have. Please reserve one idea per sticky notes, because we're going to gather all of that feedback from you and organize them on the wall. But essentially what we want to hear from you is what concerns you most pertaining to heat specifically, and what should be top priority in establishing goals and policies for the climate element in regards to addressing heat. So feel free to get writing. We will be coming around to gather your sticky notes, and then we will sort them into different categories and discuss them. Well, thank you everybody for your feedback and populating the sticky notes. Oh, maybe we have a couple. So we will go ahead and move into the discussion portion of the workshop. So I definitely want to encourage those of you who are in the audience to move your chair and circle around, especially if you have trouble hearing. And I'm going to ask that our panelists here speak loudly so everyone can hear. And we are going to start with discussing ecosystem. So what I'm reading here is, this is very prevalent to what Marnie was discussing earlier, just concerns with increasing temperatures and what the impacts of those increasing temperatures are on our ecological systems, including environmental damage. I think there's suggestions for tree planting, reforestation, ensuring ecosystem diversity. Is there anyone who would like to start and share any thoughts on heat impacts in ecosystems?
Sure. So heat waves affect shellfish, as you noted in your presentation, and other intertidal life. And then there's die-offs, that's nutrient load on Puget Sound. But it's also the fact that the low tides are daytime in the summer, and they coincide with these heat waves. So it's one of those compounding effects that you talked about. And this has long-term effects, but it all short-term effects die off right away. But it also affects the way that vegetation grows in our Puget Sound, and it will impact where eelgrass and kelp can survive, which is the home for the forage fish, which is what the salmonids eat when they try and gain weight so that they can then go and spawn. And Island County is uniquely positioned. It's got freshwater inputs from one side and seawater from the other. And so we're a great nursery for all of these fish, and the heat exacerbates the impacts to the lower level parts of the ecosystem, which then compounds it all the way up to the whales. All right, summarize that.
Yeah, I would just add to that we already have really vulnerable ecosystems that are struggling in the intersection between climate impacts and human development. And so we have areas like Deer Lagoon and the Maxwell Valley, upper and lower, and the Maxwell Tide Gate and other tide gates in our community that are up for discussion in terms of how tenable they are now and how tenable they'll be in 5 or 10 years. And so to have a really constructive conversation among property owners, farmers, conservationists, tribes, state and local government, to really understand what is the future of those tidal estuaries, tidal lagoons as habitat and as a resiliency element for human community. Because if we don't think proactively today about building relationships and agreements and plans for a restoration of what will become the salt estuaries of the future as sea level rises, the heat impact and the die-off to these areas is coming for us one way or the other, but we can soften the blow and actually turn these vulnerable ecosystems into community resilience resources if we start planting and acquiring and protecting public land today.
Yes, I hear in both of these comments too, some of these things are coming at us and they're coming at us fast. So what are the policies and goals that we can create in collaboration and understanding how our development and the kinds of planning efforts that we are doing impact those places, as well as understanding the feasibility of those places in the future? That's really important to understand. And I like that you mentioned specific places, like what are the specific places on the island that are worth that effort of restoration or even just minimizing the blow. And that takes collaboration and research, yes.
Yeah, I would also just add that if we look at the parts of our county that are the most vulnerable, we could say that's where catastrophe is coming, or we could say that's where we have the opportunity to work with the dynamic system. So instead of seeing that dynamism as the threat of catastrophe, we could see that dynamism as a need for creative investment. And so, for instance, a hard armored shoreline kills the eelgrass and kelp forest ecosystems. So we might say the shore is a place where we have to strengthen fortifications to protect homes, and that's a avoiding catastrophe kind of a mindset, but it's creating the catastrophe of loss of these marine ecosystems. So instead, why don't we say the shore is a dynamic area? Why don't we get involved in that dynamism with creative, adaptive, agile, community solution seeking, and accept and work with the dynamism of these diverse spaces.
Absolutely. And we discussed that a little bit too with the sea level rise on a few weeks back as well. Any other comments for ecosystem?
Somehow, the county has to find a way to go head to head with DNR on forestry because deforestation is exacerbated by tax policies that advantage clear cutting over forest maintenance. And right now, the Department of Natural Resources can issue a permit that circumvents our critical areas ordinances. And the moratorium on land use conversion after those clear cuts is very flexibly applied. And so I just think we as a community have clearly stated that we cherish our forests, that we need our forests, that our forests are literally going to be life-saving for the most vulnerable among us, especially as we have an aging population. And so I just think somehow our land use and taxation has to acknowledge the vital public resource of protecting maturing forests.
Absolutely. And I think that's not the first time that we've discussed maybe some differences in priorities between state level policy as well as community policy, and how can we negotiate between the two of those to ensure that local priorities take precedent.
I mean, trees are the answer to so many things. But we also need to bring in the issues of equity, areas that maybe not have as much canopy as other areas, and really look at those interrelationships. And I think looking at where tree cutting permits are granted is one way to look at this, because preserving our existing forest is great, and determining where to plant additional trees is also on the table. And I also want to bring in a built environment piece that can provide shade. Solar panels provide shade under the panel and could cool things like our parking lots.
Yeah.
Kind of getting away from that heat island effect that we see in some of the more developed areas. So we should think about siting of shade-related things.
Yes.
I think you talked about working with the Department of Transportation. What if we had solar panels on the bus stops? Because it's hot when you're waiting at the bus.
Yeah. It definitely is. And that's a good point to think, you know, in line with kind of what Arnie was saying over here, like thinking really creatively. How can we integrate different kinds of systems? There's trees that help reduce urban heat island effect. There's, you know, maybe we can leverage getting renewable energy in our communities along with.
There's green roofs. There's
yes, white roofs, green roofs.
And the building code can be changed and could change how things are built.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is maybe flowing into the building section a little, but some jurisdictions give a one height bonus for developers who are creating a green roof, 1 story height bonus. So basically, if our local jurisdictions could be encouraged to adapt to this need by basically saying, if we have a 2-story height maximum in our community, but you promise to create a living roof with a food forest on top, you can have a bonus story. If you have a 3-story building, the advantage is the neighbors are looking at a view that's a beautiful garden instead of a bunch of HVAC components. And we have that urban infill that's necessary to be compliant with GMA. And we have a building that's safer and healthier to live in.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious if there are any more comments on specifically ecosystem, or do we want to start talking about buildings?
So I think along with conversations about specifically about trees, thinking about it from a slightly different perspective of the building side, but staying in the ecosystem, that certainly in order to build something, oftentimes you have to remove things, but looking at credits available to developers or builders for, you know, I wouldn't really call it reforestation, but integration of new tree canopy and, you know, following along some metric that would provide incentive for that to be done.
Yeah. I'll go John first.
Yeah, there's also an intersection between forest and fire. You know, we've been spared major forest fires in Island County so far. But what folks in fire-prone areas are advised to do is maintain a 100-foot barrier of water around the property. That, of course, removes more trees. it also results a lot of times in those trees being replaced with lawn, which tends not to infiltrate water quite as well, increases runoff. So there's effects there. You know, the whole rainforest did catch fire a few years ago. It may be only a matter of time before we face similar risks. So we need to look at incentivizing forest management to minimize fire risk, not something we have to worry about too much, as well as, you know, the strictly economic aspects of that. So we just need to integrate fire thinking into the way that we go about developing, particularly everybody wants a cabin in the woods, and, you know, that comes with risks and costs. We need to understand those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to that point, the Conservation District is a very helpful resource, and I would continue to support and fund activities related to the Conservation District as much as possible. Because, for instance, I know that they came out and gave me some really wise counsel about fire-wise forest management practices where I live. So any kind of policy that can be created that guides continued collaboration for conservation goals to make landowners as well resourced as possible would be wise.
Yeah, absolutely.
So back to John's point, which I think comes back to things we talked about the first time around, in that we have a very difficult intersection of county and state
Yes.
entities. And so particular to fire currently, in our building code, there is sections within it that are increasing the cost of building to provide an impenetrable force, if you will, of fire, if that become the case, where the general idea, you know, comes from DNR essentially, is you will provide this much fire space around what you build. So you can't have both sides. You got to find a way to bring those together. So, and I think that you're right. We have been spared for the most part, but I've been a firefighter for 38 years as well. It's only going to be a matter of time, because management is really the key to any. You know, our county has forest management practices where you can incentivize a larger piece of property where you take care of the forest following a DNR rule, but it doesn't take but anything for it to become a pretty big deal. So, you know, you are building an asset, which is a resource to the community, because we talked about that in terms of the taxation. You're going to protect that asset, and yet we're butting heads and trying to get to what we need in order to provide elements to meet the CCA, as well as many other things within that. So again, that to me is the encouragement of trying to make sure that our county has some autonomous ability when you're fighting up against the bureaucracy, whether it has to do with shoreline armoring, if you talk about it in that respect, or you talk about it in fire sinks.
Yeah.
I want to bring up another risk, and that is heat can exacerbate wind. Heat is a driver of meteorological events, and when you have that heat cold shear, that's going to bring you winds. We already have some pretty high winds. We lose power all the time from trees falling on our power lines. We need to think about wind as it relates to heat, but also as it relates to the rest of our fires.
Yeah, right.
And wind is also a driver of sediment motion in our marine environment. And sediment moves in what they call drift cells, and that movement of sediment creates and destroys habitats. And so wind is so related to the ecosystem and is exacerbated.
Yes.
I was going to say the same thing. Is there any data on all these climate elements and how it relates to wind impacts, considering it's really prevalent here?
No one asked that question. So we're working on some projects across in the Columbia River Gorge, and we're really trying to get the scientists to come back and say, this is what we observed, right? We know that heat and cold cause wind, we know this, we know that. And they're like, yeah, we're still kind of trying to figure out the wind patterns in the Pacific Northwest and might change in the future. We do know that this is from UW Atmospheric Science. Their comment back is, yes, we have changes in all these jet streams and changes and all that, but the wind conditions will still be what we see historically, but different from the fact that they might occur more frequently. Instead of, those big windstorms might occur more frequently, but the science is still, I would say, loose on that, but, people are asking that question. Seattle City Light did a statewide, what's called Wind Watch. So it's actually a wind prediction program. You can go online, just you type in Wind Watch, it'll show you when winds are expected. They kind of have like a probability of high winds. And a lot of the meteorologists around, all your Cairo, Como, King meteorologists are using that information to kind of put out wind warnings. We know the National Weather Service is also really honing in on winds, especially because what it causes to the marine environment and waves. So
Well, and that's,
a little bit of that, it's what I say, it's coming. It's
Right.
fresh.
I think it's an important consideration as we're talking about adaptation and mitigation techniques and what will actually be feasible, what is it going to cost, and what does the future look like in the sense of problems we're already significantly dealing with. I mean, when we have a wind event that knocks out power, that's knocking out all the communication for small businesses here, it stalls the economic realities for a lot of our businesses.
Yep.
And it's pretty impactful if we sat there and said, okay, what does this look like for the county not to get that, or the state not to get that retail sales tax during the time period in which these businesses are trying to do business and cannot. It becomes a larger number than we immediately would think it would be.
And that was brought up in the interdepartmental team as well, for the county. They brought up we talked through some of these impacts as well. It was high on there, and they brought up that communication, fiber optics, all that, and that goes down, everything shuts down. And their concern is, that communication is a utility too, but also it shuts down the ability to do anything, really. Except go back to the old sliding credit card.
Well, yeah, and then that goes into the whole, education and business continuity and all that stuff for our small business owners and why that's so important.
Kind of mentioned there, though, if you put the lines underground, then it's not an issue.
Might be an easy change.
Cost and buy.
Yes, it's not exactly that, but
I'll do Marnie and then.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about farming and land stewardship in these changing conditions and how little we know, or at least how little I know about the survival rate of invasive species in heat conditions versus native and naturalized and beneficial plant species in these heat conditions. And so I would love to see the county explore some small grant programs to allow farmers and agroforesters and forest stewards to buy and plant and monitor and report back on the survival rates of desirable plant species while simultaneously working to track and remove and eradicate invasive species that we know are a fire hazard. We know Scotch broom goes up like tinder on clear cuts. We know holly burns really hot. And so I just think if people could be incentivized to plant more of what works and plant less of what harms and have some financial resources to try to support and study and report back on healthy farms and forests, we might be able to enlist a whole bunch of citizen scientists in helping us understand better how plant life evolves under these changing conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Understanding the difference between the species, the ones we want to keep and the ones maybe not so much, collaboration with local scientists. That's been kind of a theme we've brought up a few times too in these workshops as well, to help leverage those resources that we have on the island to be able to manage these things effectively.
I was also going to bring up invasive species in relation to fire risk, as well as just ecosystem health. And specifically on our county roadways, I mean, yesterday I saw the county mowers mowing 6 inches of grass in the wet season. But meanwhile, in the summertime, when all the thistles fully mature and blowing seeds everywhere, and the Scotch brooms flowering, there's no mowing to be seen. And I feel like the just a simple switch in like why we mow and why we manage our roadways in that way, and not just for like aesthetics and having a lawn on the side of the shoulder, rather than like actually we need to manage these plants because these are places where they're really proliferating is on these county roadways.
That's actually a really good point because that was a change in policy, and I can't tell you how long ago, but you know, they used to grade a shoulder. That was how they managed the road itself, and that I don't know why that changed, but it changed to the mowing effect. And yeah, Scotch broom is an invasive species, and yet there's a stretch of road here from Coopville down to the bottom of the hill along the Kettles where you could get as much Scotch broom that you want and take care of the entire state of Washington, I think. Again, you're back to that same situation. I agree with you that it's just a matter of looking at the right way of interpreting policy and then putting it into place.
I want to make 3 points related to invasives. One being, I've heard from farmers who maintain weed-free farms who say the only place we have to spray the tansy and the hemlock is the roadsides because the county's mowing machines bring in the weed seeds. So the county needs to figure out how to sterilize their equipment and not carry invasive species from site to site. Two, my organization gave the county a native shrub maintenance plan for how to protect and encourage the healthiest foliage on roadsides so that it would not allow room for invasive seeds to take root. And this was probably a couple decades ago. And the county's staff responded, whether intentionally or unintentionally, by raising all of those highlighted areas down to the ground. So the grading or mowing or complete eradication of plant life along shoulders is a lot more costly for a community than restoring and maintaining natural brush coverage that would basically leave no room for a weed seed to take hold. So if we actually had a policy of encouraging native salal in all of the roadsides where it would thrive, we might save tons of money down the road on mowing. And then third, 525 and 20 are Department of Transportation highways that are not maintained by Allen County's Public Works Department. So there needs to be some kind of interagency communication about the scourge of Scotch broom on our county roadside, on our state managed roadsides. And I think the county could lead by example by saying, we're doing a good job with our public roads. Now please, Washington State, catch up and do a good job with our highway. But until the county's really leading by example, I think we have a lot of work to do at home in addition to advocating for that state level stewardship.
Yeah.
And this is probably a question directly to you, but do you know if there's, when the county is being presented with these ideas, is somebody presenting a cost analysis for them to adequately make a decision to show exactly what you said?
Yeah, so that's something we're currently trying to plan for, hiring a consultant to do an economic study of ecosystem services in Allen County. I would love for it to be an interagency private-public partnership to basically say, environmentalists want this information, economic development professionals want this information, county staff want this information. Can we together as a community invest in a study of the economic impact of various land use decisions?
Yeah.
So that we know we're working from real data. I just
Exactly,
think
because how impactful are this, or how incentivized are you to make a decision without that, without the
Right.
true impact, or at least a projection of the cost impacts of all your options?
Right. Yeah, if anybody's interested in having the county partner with nonprofits to do that work, I would love to be a thought partner in what kind of a study we might commission.
Any more comments specifically on ecosystems?
Your comment about the invasive species and all of the additional information, I just want to let you know that the Marine Resources Committee has done restoration of shorelines, and the bane of our existence are invasive species, because we are planting native species to take over that area. And that thistle is driving us completely bonkers. And Scotch broom also. And So here we are trying to restore something. And it's just being inundated.
Just a brief personal anecdote. My mom has a serious tansy infestation on her farm, and I was helping her pull it this summer. And after about 3 hours of working pulling the tansy, I collapsed into unconsciousness, was transported to Whitby Health by ambulance, came to about an hour later. My blood pressure was like below 80 beats per minute for 6 hours before they felt like it was strong enough for me to be sent home. And so, there are human health impacts of letting invasive species run wild. And if somebody like my mom could actually get help from local government, I know the conservation district could come out and say, here's a plan, here's a way that you could eradicate that. But it would be so nice if there was like a county weed control team that could come out and help and, work with environmental scientists and botanists and farmers and horticulturalists to understand the various treatment methods and make the lowest impact intervention possible and actually help landowners beat this thing, we'd all benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing the, especially the public health implications as well. It's really important.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I think there's fire over here, so maybe we'll move to fire. So I think a big concern with increasing heat is the increased instance of drought, which then impacts, creates a tinderbox, impacts the likelihood of fire. So listed here are a few concerns about fire, specifically as it pertains to insurance costs and housing, the health impacts of not only fire but associated smoke. So even if there aren't fires here, there's still smoke impacts from fires that are nearby, as I think we've all experienced just about once every summer the past 5 years. Is there any comments people would like to make about fires?
Yeah, let me start off with an idea. I don't know if you've heard of First Street Foundation. It's an organization started on First Street in New York, is the name. The first thing they did was come up with a flood risk for properties. And I think Truly was the first one that picked that up and started displaying it on their property listings. Zillow's now using them as well. And they've expanded beyond flood risk. The flood risk is fascinating because it does cover Island County in great detail. And my local beach, for example, 117 out of 117 homes on that beach are listed as at least 9 out of 10 extreme flood risk. But it also lists fire risk, and not surprisingly, those are all pretty low. But it's out there, and mine is 3 out of 10. I'm not on the beach, I'm some other ways. There are going to be properties on the island that are much higher than that. And with an appropriate subscription, you can actually look at this by area, whole streets and neighborhoods, and see what the fire risk is in those. That's going to impact your fire insurance because the insurance companies for sure are looking at that. The interesting thing about First Street's algorithm is it doesn't just use these climate projections and so on. It actually looks at the claims people have filed for these particular events. So it looks at where people have filed flood claims, and it looks at where people have filed fire claims. So moving on from that, we can get some idea then of what the fire risks look like in different parts of the island. And then we can think about how we can minimize some of those risks. And I want to jump right into fireworks. A good number of those homes on the beach near me belong to second homeowners who can't shoot off fireworks in Bellevue and Seattle. So they can't here and do it. We actually have a war going on between Shore Avenue and Sunlight Beach Road every 4th of July to see who can blow up the most money. It's just totally insane. We can't ever seem to get a type 2 burn ban before 4th of July. There's been years when it's happened on 5th of July. But we need to delegate that authority down to something a little closer to the scene, perhaps down to the local fire chiefs, instead of having the county fire marshal make that decision. Because it's just getting increasingly dangerous. So basically, the other thing that happens is because it's 4th of July, and everybody's up. That's our maximum water use weekend.
Mm.
Our reservoir is struggling at that point, and we are at a point where it's going to be barely possible to provide a fire plug. I mean, sure, they bring a tanker, but it takes them a while to get there. A house can be fully involved before that tank makes it. So we really start needing to look at that firework element in how that intersects with fire risk, and give our officials the power to do something about it.
Yeah, and I really like that you mentioned even that, like, how that impacts water usage and the ability to fight those fires and management. That's really important, especially as we talk about aquifer. Yeah.
One of the problems with all of this is that historical predictions don't work anymore.
Yes.
In 2021, when the heat dome was sitting over us, there's a little town just north of us in BC, Lytton, that reached 121 degrees. It was not Death Valley, that was Lytton, BC, and they burned the ground the next day. On this island, everyone is pretty convinced that we can't have a big fire. But things are changing, they're changing rapidly. We got a heat dome sitting over us that does that kind of thing, and we've got a big fire, really big fire. How do we get off? There's a tiny little 2-lane road over the bridge on this side, and the south has got the ferry. And I don't see anyone really paying attention to that. And saying, what do we do with the population? And when you look at risk assessment, when you look at insurance companies or whatever, they're looking at worst case scenario. They're not looking at, well, what might happen, and we need to be really serious about, is it going to happen this summer? Probably not. Probably not in 5 years. But man, as the time goes on, that danger is going to become ever more present, and we need to be looking at that.
Absolutely. I think definitely emergency management, emergency planning, this could get really bad. It's not a far off possibility. How are we going to be resilient and protect health and safety in if that happens?
And some of them might be making giving enough bike lanes on both sides of our major roads, so that in a really dangerous situation, you've at least got 2 lanes that could go in one direction and one the other way. Something that we're looking at.
Right. Let's see. Uh-oh. Maybe we'll go here first. And then we'll go here.
I'm just also thinking about people's health and safety during extreme smoke events.
Yes.
And I'm wondering how we can incentivize there to be more what we call third spaces, like a place where you can be together in public without having to spend money. Because right now, if somebody wants to be in an air-conditioned space and they're a member of the public, they can't necessarily go into a cafe unless they can afford to buy a latte. They can't necessarily go into a business unless they're trying to purchase something. Our libraries are good for that, but are they? Do they have the capacity to take in a lot of people on a busy day, especially when everybody's trying to get in out of the smoke and everybody who doesn't have air conditioning at home needs a safe place?
Yeah.
So I guess I would just think about places like in Langley we have the Commons, which is a nonprofit that does serve coffee, but you can also go in there and just sit. If you can't afford a cup of coffee, sit and browse the books. But it's a financially struggling endeavor. So I guess I'm just wondering, how can our county invest in creating more spaces like that for people to be safe together indoors when needed?
Yeah.
And also safe outdoor spaces with tree canopy and shade.
Yeah, parks, right? And I like the compounding effects of smoke and heat, right? During really hot summer, you may need to keep your windows open at night, but it may be like smoke, air quality concerns with that. Go here next.
Yeah, I also want to bring up, I know it's been brought up in previous workshops, but I think it's incredibly important, is that the county needs to know what our water resource is and what our aquifer health is. And I feel like it's not being monitored to the extent that we need it to be. And especially with the population growth that we're expecting to happen in the next 10 years, or 20 years, how many more wells are possible before we don't actually have, like John's saying, at the 4th of July, when we need to, if there's a fire and we need to pump some water out, is there actually going to be water there for that? And we're kind of just flying blind as far as our water resources go. And that needs to be like top priority, because you don't want to have to figure that out after it's too late.
Right.
Then what?
Absolutely not.
I was really happy that the Skagit County Comprehensive Plan was released with their climate element just a few days ago, on the 22nd of October. And they had exactly what Marnie is saying, a resilience hub. And they called for resilience hubs for heat-related and other extreme events, including smoke. And the concept came from Urban Sustainability Directors Network, which is, well-respected planning group. And they talked about not just a temporary emergency shelter, but a resilience hub that enhances social cohesion by bringing together residents in a place to gather and provide cool filtered air for the summer, but also an opportunity for just to charge your phone, to do all of the many things that we can't do when there's a power outage. So it could be outfitted with solar, it could have backup battery storage, it could do all of those things. And it seems obvious that we should come together for creation of these resilience hubs.
Absolutely.
I would take that one step further and have it be a year-round endeavor where on a non-emergency day, you come to the Resilience Hub to learn about and connect with your neighbors.
And they talked about providing basic, public health.
Yeah, first aid demonstrations and all of that. And I just think normalizing interdependence and community connectedness before the emergency, because frankly, if somebody says there's an emergency heat shelter open, I'm gonna think, well, I don't need it the most, I'm okay, I don't really have any health indicators that mean this heat wave is super dangerous for me, so I'm not gonna go down to the emergency shelter because that's for people who need it most. Whereas if it's the Resilience Hub, I'm gonna be like, wow, resilience is for all of us, I'm gonna get down there and check it out. So I just think using language and hosting in a manner that makes everyone feel welcome all the time would be really advantageous.
Yeah, and getting people familiar with the space, right? In an emergency when maybe anxiety is high, you may not really feel comfortable going to a place you've never been before, even though you may need it. But if you've had some exposure, maybe that would increase the likelihood of going.
I just want to, having these areas for people who you shouldn't have to spend money in order to be in a safe place, right? And enjoy your community. But the other side of that is we actually want people to spend money too. And every time we have a significant event that keeps people indoors, that impacts, again, our economic reality during that time period. We have events, which 50% of LTAC funds are dedicated to for community events, tourism events, that will all be impacted by the quality of the air outside and whether or not people are going to come. We had a major fire event smoke event during, say, the Oak Harbor Music Festival. What would that look like to that festival, to the Oak Harbor's economy? What those tourism dollars bring in during that time period, and community dollars as well, people who live here, who go out and spend money. So anytime there's an event that keeps people indoors, especially in an area where everything is outdoors, it's pretty significant to our local economy. So it's something to consider as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just one thing I wanted to say to your point too, we talk about emergency management. One of the things that we've had for a while is the mutual aid agreements that we have between the Naval Air Station and the local community for emergency management. So those resources are at the community's disposal should we need them, and should we be able to use DNR and other assets too. So I don't think we've really looked at it from, say, like an evacuation standpoint, but we've looked at it resources coming in and other resources that the state would be bringing in. Our assets are there for the community as well.
Any other comments as it pertains to fire?
One last one. Just thinking about our infrastructure in terms of resilience to fire. like how many of our septic systems would melt, how many of our wellheads would melt, how many of our electrical transformers would melt, and looking to places like, for instance, Winthrop or Twist, or a community that's already been impacted by wildfire, to say what infrastructure failed and when you rebuilt, what did you have to consider and do differently? And maybe build in some standards so that development going forward is responsive to what we've learned from other communities.
Yeah, directly from that. Conference I was at last week, I wound up at one point talking to the mayor of Bend, which is a small town out in the Palouse, so a long way from any forest. And they've had 3 fires there. The last one was in 2020. And it was a combine harvester, spark from a combine harvester setting fire to a wheat field. And that blew into town. And I just made sourdough bread this morning with wheat, grown dryland wheat, just like that, up here on the prairie. From the farm up there. It could happen here.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a forest. So we need to really be aware of all of these risks. I mean, that just took off there and the gusty winds blew that fire straight into town. So, our agricultural community, I'm sure that Washington State Extension, WSU Extension, talks about all of these things, but we just need to make sure that the ag community is prepared for gunshots.
Yeah.
And yeah, he took out the well in that town, 1 or 2 wells, and crippled their ability to actually fight the fire, and they're still trying to get it back. Malden rather, also out in the Palouse, just rebuilt that fire station, which they lost.
Wow.
And again, no trees.
Yeah, definitely expanding how we think about forest fires, not just being forest
Yeah.
fires.
They're catastrophic economic events as well.
Yes.
No,
Totally.
use.
Yeah.
Destroyed the economy of the town. I mean, Malden lost 85% of buildings.
Wow. All right. Let's move on to, I think this is public health. All right, I think something that's been mentioned multiple times is that there are public health issues with the associated increase in temperature for sensitive populations, but also the compounding effects of wildfire smoke and how that impacts vulnerable populations as well. Does anyone want to start with any comments with increased heat and public health concerns?
I put your resiliency hub comment on the sheet.
Yes.
I was listening to a podcast that was talking about kidney disease in agricultural workers, and especially in equatorial regions. And I learned a little bit about the economics of large-scale food production and how a lot of harvesting workers are incentivized by being paid per piece versus per hour. And I'm just curious whether our county has very many agricultural workers who are paid by pound of produce picked versus by hour worked. Because what I came to understand through that podcast was that when workers are paid per pound, they're competing with each other to keep up with the pickable produce on the vines. They're also competing with the clock as far as getting as much picked as possible before closing time. And they might work 12 hours straight without taking a drink break because it's a 5-minute walk to the hydration station and they can't afford to pause. So if we as a county could both encourage our local agricultural employers to pay by the hour and pay fair wages and provide shade canopies and hydration stations, but also lobby to the state to make that a state standard, I just think protecting the people who harvest our food is vitally important.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in those working conditions. Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
As we see more stress on our population and public health, we're going to see more stress on our systems, our health systems, and whether or not we can withstand that here with our current hospital and clinics. It worries me to think about that from a standpoint of what we saw with COVID, obviously extreme case of overloading our hospital systems, medical systems. As we get into more heat-related events, those things occurring as well. And how do we mitigate that? What does that look like? Is there plans within the public health department to try to impact how we service those who need help when it all happens at the same time?
Yeah, managing that influx and making sure there's enough resources.
I also think it's really been great to see the Department of Health starting to use more bilingual materials and making sure that we have people we're trying to speak with represented in the room as we advocate for better public health outcomes. And even thinking about the comment I just made about farm workers' health, I remember at last year's Washington State legislative session, there was a protest of farm workers who felt that legislation designed to increase equity and safety actually cost them their jobs, and they were rallying to ask to have the old standards back so they could work again. And I just think about how I can't be the spokesperson for agricultural workers because I don't know, I don't walk in their shoes. I think when we think about public health outcomes, we should have elders at the table. We should have people living with chronic illness at the table. We should have people whose pre-existing conditions make them most likely to suffer illness and death in an extreme heat event. And so I just want to really congratulate the Department of Public Health for what they're trying to do around engaging more public participation in these talks, and say, I hope the policies really center tapping into and elevating the perspectives of those most impacted.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, intersection with drinking water here again. There's a lot of folks on the island don't trust what comes out of their tap either because it's, they're on a water system, they don't trust that, or they're on a private well and it's not real good quality, but they just wind up buying bottled water. And so water costs money for them. Every time they get thirsty, they got to think about what it's costing them. Or they run out, they need to get out to the store, it's smoky and hot outside. About a year ago, I wound up Googling, can I buy bottled water with? And Google finished the sentence for me, food stamps. And the answer is yes, you can, sadly enough. But we need to think about, at high heat and smoke stress times like that, we need to think about making sure that we're providing that there's some way for some of our compromised residents to access drinking water. A lot of them is hard. And at times of severe heat, the need is much greater.
Yes.
Older people don't feel as thirsty. I mean, the admissions to the local hospital, things like dehydration, shoot up so much. So something we need to be concerned about in that public health access.
Yeah, especially don't want it to be an excessive burden to people who are already financially burdened, especially during an emergency situation.
And I would suggest public watering stations with reusable cups as opposed to somehow making these available to everybody, because these contribute to the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing all this trouble in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, so I collected more articles, and this is for a chief heat officer. And it's part of their hazard mitigation plan. But it is so interrelated with all of the public health issues. And the idea of having your hazard mitigation plan, which is more of an emergency response type plan, be something that is used every day. And having someone like a chief heat officer that is monitoring these issues, I think it doesn't need, the chief heat officer doesn't need to be the creation of a new FTE. It can be just a hat that someone wears that brings that awareness to all of the departments of Island County. Everybody needs to be working together on this. It's a public-private partnership, but it's also within the county to break down their silos.
Just to bring up a comment that I think was made at our first gathering of this series, I think somebody suggested having like a resilience director that would actually have director level access and responsibilities and would work across departments to make sure that these good ideas get implemented. And that would be an FTE because I feel like it would come with a sufficient level of responsibility that it wouldn't be competing with other tasks. But, you know, if we had a resilience director on staff now with director level authority, I would have more confidence that our stream health would have some solutions already underway after the study came out 8 months ago, as an example.
Right, somebody whose primary focus is to move these initiatives forward and to help support other departments and kind of integrating and understanding how impending climate hazards impact their work.
Yeah, I just really want to back that up. It's, you know, it's hard in the county, it's even worse at the state level, to get the different departments to talk to each other. State level, it's so siloed, it's insane, but we have a bit of that problem at the county level as well. Not with every department, just with some, of course. I didn't say that. But if my friend Randy was sitting here today, she'd be saying, where's public works? And it's a good question. They're not here. And we need somebody to keep the different departments' attention focused on this particular issue. So that's definitely something that's actionable at the county level. Is to put somebody in place whose job it is to try to focus the different departments working together to work with this issue. Because otherwise, everybody has their own responsibilities, legal responsibilities, laws they have to implement, get all that, but this stuff tends to fall through the cracks.
Yeah. Any other comments pertaining to specifically public health and heat? All right, moving,
I'm sorry, I just want to mention our school children
yes.
and how chronically underfunded school districts are, how important like public levy tax dollars are to allow schools to do their most basic work. But I would just say any partnerships that the county can have with local school districts to make sure that schools have adequate HVAC for those smoky days, schools have adequate farming programs for kids to be safely connected to nature, schools have adequate nutrition and transportation. Anything that keeps a kid learning at school in a safe, clean environment is a great source of resilience on a hot and smoky day.
Absolutely. All right. I'm going to skip other for now and come back to that at the end. Some of those comments might be captured just with the conversation we're having. We talked about agriculture a little bit, but some of the concerns in this agriculture section is one, impacts to workers, which we've discussed a little bit here thus far, as well as the heat stress to crops. There's definitely like an economic impact to that, and as well as some of these agricultural areas can be wildfire risks as well. In addition to forest, are there does anybody want to start with comments about agriculture and increased heat?
I can start. I mean, there's so much new research and so many new farming practices that have been developed in the last decade or two under kind of the umbrella of regenerative agriculture that have major solutions to a lot of climate impacts, resilience-wise, water infiltration, for wildlife diversity and species diversity across the board. And in whatever way the county can incentivize those types of practices to be happening on more and more of our agricultural lands, better. Heat specifically can be really stressful for animals, for livestock, and there's a lot of practices around silvopasture, incorporating trees into our pasture systems that can alleviate that. It also alleviates the heat stress on the soil, having that shade. The majority of our pasture resources are cool season grasses, which stop growing when the soil temperatures hit 65 degrees. And so there can be a major impact to those resources for hay, for people's, just horses and pets and those types of animals, but also our directly to our food animals and our ability to raise those locally. So being incentivizing and trying to get more, I think, citizen science on the ground in the farming sector to see what practices are helping and what we can improve on to build soil. I mean, ultimately to build soil. When we build soil, we improve the biology. We have better aggregation. It holds more water, so it's more drought resilient. And there's major
Carbon capture.
yeah, carbon capture as well, definitely. And so diversifying, I think, what we grow and especially, I personally am a pasture focused farmer, and so that's my main focus. But diversifying our fields and having more kind of like a meadow ecosystem with not just 3 or 4 types of plants that we're relying on to produce all of our forage. Yeah, just improving diversity.
Yeah, it sounds like the county just tapping into the wealth of knowledge that's already in existence and creating incentives and policy that align with best practices.
Yeah, I want to plus one everything Kevin just shared, and also share that I think there's an obstacle to farming for people who can't afford large tracts of land. And so anything the county can do to make it possible and legal and incentivized to farm on small parcels would be advantageous. You know, if you can get a bunch of people growing on a 2-acre or 5-acre farm, and each of them is innovating and getting some support from the county to test and report back on these regenerative agricultural methods, that's going to be more climate resilient than one farmer on 80 acres growing one crop. And I think that the county has made good progress with making it easier for people to have farm stands. I understand that there's still a challenge around people with small acreage who want to be considered farmers and who want to get into agricultural tax programs, but can't because they don't have a 40-acre or an 80-acre parcel. And then I just think about something like Bell's Farm, which is an 80-acre parcel, if I'm correct, and how I doubt that any one young farmer is going to be able to buy that and work it. But if we could have a community farming trust where people could buy into a co-farming endeavor where there might be 10 or 20 farmers working that 80-acre parcel, I just think about what kind of diversity of brilliance and crops and solutions we could get if we found pathways for the county to support more farmers to bring more regenerative practices forward.
Absolutely.
So I have no ag experience, but I live next to that farm. I spent a lot of time talking to both Kyle and another farmer, and so he is a regenerative farmer as well. And I can definitely see the benefits of the movement of the livestock and maintaining the health of the soils, the plants, as opposed to going out and just pasturing until there's no pasture left. Which has a direct impact on obviously our aquifer itself. But the flip side of that is it is not economically feasible, and so there's a lot of things associated with incentivizing the ability for our ag, whether it be straight ag, regenerative ag tourism, to be a part of the ability to us move forward with policy that provides a pathway for that.
Absolutely.
That'd be great to have the Woodley Commit on Land Trust as a part of this discussion because they have land made available to that farm school, for instance, to put it back into a regenerative kind of thing. And so I think there are people that are not at the table that maybe could have the discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Land Trust partnered with Farm School to purchase what's called the Keystone Reserve now, and they're planning to use that as kind of an incubator to help beginning farmers get going to farm just small amounts, just a couple of acres if they want to. But sooner or later, they're going to need to graduate that program. And I've been following the organic farm school as long as I've been on the island, 13 years, and very few of the graduates from there have actually been able to break through, buy land, and grow that into a successful farm. I know some of the first two did, but it's really, really challenging to do that because of the tax structures, because of the historical, I mean, I'm talking going back centuries, land use and land ownership patterns in the county. And there's areas there where some creative thinking is possible. Yeah, it's never going to make a ton of money, but that's because we're operating against the backdrop of heavily subsidized agriculture, you know, where USDA and various other entities are paying people to grow alfalfa in the desert. It's hard to compete, but it's part of the island's character. It's part of what brings tourists here. It's part of our resilience going forward, and it needs help. And it's a very self-sufficient community. They do a lot. They're great people. I hang out with them a lot. Conservation District helps. WSU Extension helps, but what can the county do? Talk to these people, see what can we do to help bring more young farmers into the business, because we're going to need it.
Absolutely. Start here.
Obviously, everybody here, I don't know if you know, but I'm fairly new to this position, so I don't know all the economic stats right off the top of my head. But just for consideration, just so everybody understands this, and from the change from 2017 to 2002 in the farming community here, for just the market value of the products sold from the farming community here, had a 96% increase from about 12 million to $23.5 million. So it's a pretty significant change in activity, and so it's something that really needs to be looked at.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've been thinking about agriculture as being on land, but don't forget shellfishing and fishing and all of the marine agriculture that takes place.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely needs to be a priority, especially here.
And heat is a big problem for these shellfishermen because of the extremes in temperature that occur in the summer when the tide is out, when the shellfish are just floating.
Yeah, and to John's point there too, I mean, taking a look at Whidbey Communal Land Trust, the work that they had done to the Keystone property, I mean, that's one major project on bringing the ag school there. That was a lot of multiple entities funding that component. I mean, state level, federal level, Navy level going into that. But it's really important. What are the barriers to the next step? I mean, it's one thing to be able to have a land trust be able, as a kind of quasi-jurisdictional entity, to do that and be able to pull in all of that stuff to write grants. It's a totally different story when you send these farmers out. Like, what are the barriers that keep them from producing $12 million worth of products? So,
Right.
yeah.
How do
we get to that next step? I mean, we've got tier 1, tier 2, but now what's to tier 3 and the actual components of living and growing in all fats.
Absolutely.
Trying not to butt in, but I do want to put a quick plug in. Next week at our planning commission meeting, the Agricultural Resources Committee of Island County is going to be presenting on how they're working to engage farmers in our comprehensive plan and to consider what ag policies need to change as a part of the comp plan update. They received some grant money from the state to do that work and to engage with us in the comprehensive plan. So this is something we're going to dig into deeper. I encourage you to attend the meeting or listen to it afterward. All the meetings are posted online and curious about that. Planning commission is at the board room. Yeah, it's Wednesday evening at 6 p.m.
Awesome. And I am looking at the time, and it looks like we do have 15 minutes left of the discussion portion before we do wrap up comments and open to the audience to ask questions. So thinking maybe we can transition to buildings unless there's a couple additional comments about agriculture that we want to share.
Of just prioritizing farmland preservation and especially with development pressure, because we don't have that many 40 plus acre farms left anymore anyway. And I think those larger farms do have their place and are very important as well as smaller farms. But once those are divided in any way, they're never going back. And then we're going to have more homes, more driveways, more impervious surfaces. These open spaces are so critical to our island county, just the feel of it, the rural character, but also ecologically and economically. So it's a key priority.
Yeah,
Is preserving these farmlands, especially that edge habitat, is some of the most diverse habitat we have, where the forest meets the field, and especially someone who's really focused on good, sound, agroecological stewardship, it can really enhance that.
Absolutely. And I like the comment of, once it gets developed, can't go back. So ensuring that we prioritize protecting those spaces is pretty critical. Okay, we touched on buildings a little bit at the beginning. There's some suggestions here for incentivizing urban green spaces to minimize urban heat island effect, green roofing, solar siting, building credits. Is there anybody who wants to start about buildings as it pertains to increasing temperatures?
I feel like I love to be the one who starts, and I'm sorry if I'm speaking more than I should. I'm watching for other hands going up. I just want to touch on what Kevin just shared and say the way to avoid subdividing our large farms and cutting down our precious forests is to do smart infill development in our urban areas. And I know this year's GMA updates brought in a little bit of a conundrum because they want housing of every economic band in every kind of developable area. So there's a contradiction there because the purpose of the Growth Management Act is to keep development in urbanized areas, but this new addition says, and we need to develop in the rural areas. And so I would just say being really smart about how and where we develop so that we start with a conservation first approach to saying what's most precious, what are the farms we need to protect, what are the wetlands we need to protect, what are the drainage areas that are already unstable that we don't want to disturb earth in, and what are the public treasures that we want to make available for wildlife or for people or for recreation. And I feel like if we were to take a community exercise around mapping our most beloved places and our most ecologically important and economically and culturally important places and say, let's protect all that and look at what's left, and then be smart about developing into what's left, that's a better approach than this sort of haphazard, let's develop where people want to build a house and then see if there's anything left to save. And I just think we've been, as a whole society, since the Enclosure Acts in the 1600s in Europe, we have been in a sort of a privatize and develop first, protect and make public later stance. And I think we need to protect what's precious to the public health and then see what's left for private development.
Absolutely.
So I think that there's a couple of things that jumping off from the GMA, there are ways to incentivize continuation of infill in the urban areas. I was studying, going back up real quick. Nationwide, we're about 3 million units short of what we need for housing. So whether that's housing in multifamily, single-family homes, accessory dwelling units. And so in the building industry, nothing moves fast. It's, just kind of a norm. And whether that's fast in movement of new product brought to market, whether that's working within new regulations or helping, like we're talking here with new regulations to incentivize, for instance. So I was studying some high-density infill work in the city of Bellingham and basically reading code to understand. They have where you could, in a multifamily area, you could infill with apartments, you could infill with actual, really look like duplexes or multiplexes, but they're sold as townhomes, so you own your own piece even though you're attached to your next door neighbor. All of those things though are incentivized by creating advantageous effects to the environment. So whether that be through a combination of pervious, impervious areas, whether that be through on parcel stormwater filtration, and sort of all those things are all tied together into an awful lot of what we talk about. I mean, again, not being an expert in the ag industry, but I've grown up here my entire life and I've been around farming my entire life. And so I've seen what I think is good farming and what is not good farming because of how it affects simply just the land. So I think that in the building aspect, we have to incentivize through credits or things of that nature. Wayne is very familiar with, at the state level, there is a state energy code council, which is, I think, fairly heavily skewed towards more conservation than not, and yet at the same time, I said earlier, building does not, and building products really don't move fast enough to keep up with what it is we desire to try to attain with new buildings. So as a for instance, in the most current building code, we have to build to a certain standard that is almost not attainable, not because we are good builders, because we don't have the products to actually make it happen. And so when we create policy that isn't attainable, it really starts to put defeat into the work that you want to do. So I encourage the thought process to dive deeper into things such as that when it comes to building, using, the integration of solar panels into a home is a great idea that comes with an incredibly high upfront cost. So you've got to find a way to help somebody, no different than trying to get a farmer on his own 40-acre piece of land. It's the same issue, the same context.
Yeah. Just a question for clarification. The materials that they're not available to you, from what sense? That they don't exist? They're just too expensive, hard to get, or all of the above?
All of the above. So I would qualify that, yes, we're on an island. We can get basically any material that you could get anywhere else in the United States. Okay, so that's not an issue. But our most recent energy code changed where they changed the value of the windows that we use. And going into it, it was about a 30% increase in the cost of those windows, which you're going to pay for something up front to get a benefit out the backside. That's understandable. But they weren't making something that would actually obtain that.
That's what I was
So
talking
here you have regulation passed down by the state, which didn't have product available to do. So, and we've
That's what I was trying
watched
to
that year after year after year. And again, I think nothing wrong with going in that direction, but you have to be able to provide the avenue to get there. And
Right.
oftentimes it's regulation or policy, and that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, I really appreciate what you shared about the kinds of innovations that are possible, but also the cost of doing I would say the economic cost, but also the timing and scheduling cost of doing the most low impact development possible. And I just wonder about how Island County can do better at incentivizing that smart, green, urban infill development. Because historically, I feel like the county sets policies about wanting people to build in urban areas and sets allocations of populations that suggest that people will live in urban areas, but then the reality is the trend is most of our development happens in rural areas, which then harms the farms and the forests, as we talked about. So is there some kind of expedited permitting and subsidization of green technology that can be provided for people building in the urban areas that says, if you're building multifamily housing, if you're building affordable housing, if you're building green housing, if you're creating a living roof, if you're doing organic on-site stormwater filtration, we give you better, faster access to building permits and partner with cities so that those things are easier to achieve.
So, bounce back off of that. A perfect example right now in Island County, they issue 35 accessory dwelling units a year. That's it. So kudos to the county. We increased the square footage of that from 1,000 to 1,200 square feet. The understanding is a couple of threefold. First off, the demographic, as you show in several of your maps, is aging. And we have an older demographic to start with. So it is not uncommon for me to come in and build either attached to or detached a home so that mom or mom and dad can now live together with their adult children, right? That's one way that we are trying to help in the lack of units. What that does do is it takes into account that typically speaking, okay, now you're not drilling another well, you're using the same well, you're using more water, but we're going to use more water. We're probably using the same septic system or maybe marginally increasing it. And as opposed to building a new home, and that's, let's say, under roof is a couple thousand square feet, you're resource-wise, you're using less resources, you're taking care of what's necessary. But again, there's a perfect example of where policy, and I know last year, every single one of those was used, and I think that we may have come up to, or maybe haven't used all those this year. There's 3 left. So cyclically, I believe that's going to change. I mean, in my own business, I probably build 1.5 or 2 a year.
I want to clarify that statistic because my understanding is that Island County grants 35 permits, maybe it's 30, for detached ADUs in rural areas annually. That there's no limit on permits to build an ADU in the urban areas, and that it's actually strongly encouraged to build ADUs in the urban areas. There was also state legislation that was introduced but eventually not adopted this year, looking at expanding access to permits to build ADUs in rural areas. And the reason that it didn't pass was that ecologically, socially, and economically, when this issue was analyzed, it came forth that encouraging detached ADU construction in rural areas contradicts the primary goals of the Growth Management Act. It functionally doubles density in the communities where it's widely adopted, because for every detached ADU that you're putting in, you're also potentially creating a new driveway. You may lease it to another family to live in it as though it's their primary home. You may even create a long-term lease that's functioning like a sale. And we actually see that property values escalate and land acquisition gets harder to achieve for lower and middle class families in areas where detached ADUs become the norm among rural home sites. So for a lot of reasons, detached ADUs in the rural area don't keep people close to the infrastructure and services that protect public well-being and don't equal better economic outcomes for people seeking affordable housing.
I will say I'm looking at the time and we've got about a half hour left. So I am going to look at our other categories and make sure that they're covered. And
I want to add one last thing to the building issue, and it has to do with shoreline development and additional bulkheads and how that affects our forage fish habitat. And just raising that, it wasn't necessarily heat related, but we would be continuing to wipe out our shellfish and impact other industry that we have with additional shoreline development. So building on the shoreline.
We did discuss that during the first.
I imagine you did. And then just want to make that link back.
Yeah. And I think to that point, we talk a lot about whether or not shoreline armoring is useful to protect houses. What we talked very little about is how much shoreline armoring harms adjacent bluffs and marine habitat. And I think we need to normalize having the conversation about what dies because of hard armoring, not just what might be protected for a little while because of hard armoring.
What changes when you have hard armoring is that the waves take the sediment out and you're left with cobble. Without that kind of fine-grained sediment, you don't have large fish laying eggs, you don't have eelgrass living just offshore, and so you affect the entire ecosystem. Even though the bulkhead is here and the ecosystem is there. It's wave action, which is wind related. I mean, it ties so many things together. I could talk about that forever.
All right, I will gather us back, and I do want to make sure we're focusing the conversation on heat-related impacts.
And it does.
Yes, yeah. And so I'll just give a brief synopsis over here. I do think that these comments have been covered in the various different sections. Specifically for economic, there's a cost of adaptation versus mitigation and cost implications to any kind of extreme heat events that might impact people leaving their homes and spending money, as well as impacts to agriculture and crop yields. Also impacts the tax base and money that is coming in. And for water, these also have been covered. Concerns for increased drought, as well as specifically the aquifer being drained in any kind of extreme circumstance. Definitely a need for understanding the health and availability of water in the aquifer during these times. And I will leave maybe a minute for a couple closing comments for economic or water, and then I think we definitely want to give Emily a few minutes to discuss wrap up as far as what we've heard thus far, as well as give the audience opportunity to answer questions. Any additional comments?
So what I haven't seen anywhere else is any tribal rights issues, and we really should be noting that in so many of these.
Yeah, no, that's definitely important to note.
I just wanted to ask where the county's thinking is on creating a greenhouse gas emissions reduction sub-element, because even though it's not legally required at this time, everything we do in that area reduces the likelihood of these issues being even more exponentially impactful to us. And I think the economic impact of not being proactive about greenhouse gas emissions reduction is going to bite us in the end.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just strongly encourage the county to be proactive about developing and adopting that sub-element before we're asked to by the state, but now as a recommended course of action.
Okay, so we just wanted to create a little bit of time and space at the end here to initially just say thank you for donating your time to this process, and it's been a very valuable exercise for us, and I hope that you all have gotten something out of it as well. So we didn't want to walk away without reflecting back a little of what we've heard. I don't want you to consider this a summary of everything everybody said. So if I don't say what, something that you contributed, don't feel like that's going to be lost. We are going to create a proper summary of this. But I did want to take a minute just to kind of reflect back some of the key themes that we heard. And then I'll run through kind of next steps and what we're going to do with this information, how we're going to move forward with the climate sub-element. So what we heard. So first of all, just a recognition that climate impacts are very complex and hard to talk about, right? All of these topics are very interrelated that we've identified here. And we absolutely heard and recognized that we can't address any of them in isolation, right? They all need to be kind of considered in their overlapping and compounding effects. We heard loud and clear that more collaboration is needed with state agencies, with scientists, with research institutions, within our county departments, and with residents. We heard that. We heard a clear ask to follow the science and requests for more data collection, more data sharing, and to use metrics to measure our progress. We heard that folks really want to be able to give input, but more importantly, you want to see changes implemented and not just be part of a plan that sits on a shelf. We want that too. There was a strong sense of urgency expressed by all of the panelists and the public in these workshops. We heard that homes are being inundated now, that water systems are on the edge of receivership, and environments are changing all around us. We understand that where we're starting from is scary, and these climate impacts are only going to make things worse, and we share that fear. I think inherent in the discussions that we've had in these workshops are tensions in the priorities that are being identified. We have massive sticky notes here, and they don't all fit together, right? There's tensions between them, and there's tensions between what people around the table have been saying, and that was intentional, right? We need to grapple with those tensions. There's tensions with who we are as a community too, right? We're islands with finite resources. We recognize that. We have an economy built largely on tourism, agriculture, and our Navy base. Our climate impacts are going to continue to put pressure on these assets. We're going to have to find ways to balance these tensions as we move forward. Our community, we heard around the table that people want to see action. They want to see issues addressed now in our comprehensive plan and not kicked down the road. And we feel very grateful that we got the climate funding and we were able to bring parametrics on board to complete this climate element. My team is fully committed to not pushing off issues and trying to address what we can in this comprehensive plan. I will say in this work, we must consider measured actions and outcomes that are kind of within the county government's control and within the scope of the comprehensive plan. So that's the lens we're going to be using as we move forward. Our local government very rarely steps out ahead of state and federal policy. That doesn't mean we can't be creative with what we do locally. These workshops were meant to be kind of an initial conversation into this very complex topic. I think in that they were very effective and we got a lot of good feedback out of them. The challenge is going to be in the next step of creating goals and policies from all of this information. We have an expert team here to help us with that work. And, if experience has taught us anything, it's that well thought out policy never happens quickly. So please be patient with us. And developing a well prioritized plan is going to be our best bet toward action. So in these next steps, we're going to be asking for help and input on how to prioritize to make our plan implementable. We're going to need balanced input from all perspectives, and we're going to need buy-in at every level. This is going to be effective. So with that, I'll go to the next slide, which is a couple next steps. So we're going to be summarizing the input from these workshops so that we have a record and some of these items to bring forward. I mentioned this in a previous workshop, but we have an internal team that we call our climate action team, which is representatives from all the departments across the county. So public health and public works and facilities and all of the different departments have representatives. We've been meeting monthly. And so as a wrap up to these workshops, we're going to bring this back to them and get their input on what they heard. We have some members who have been sitting in the audience here listening attentively. We want to make sure we get their feedback before we move forward. And then our team is going to kind of shift gears here into the next phase, which is writing goals and policies. So we will be, reviewing the priorities we heard during these workshops to develop the draft goals and policies. And we'll be pivoting our climate action team into what we're calling a policy advisory team, which is a smaller group to kind of advise on the development of these goals and policies. We would love to be able to reach out to some of you, the stakeholders around the table, as a sounding board as we do this work. When we're grappling with issues and not sure how to prioritize, we'd like to continue to reach out to folks here to do that work. So next, just a quick timeline. It's a little fuzzy, sorry. So our work shifts kind of to developing these goals and policies now, and that will continue through the early part of the year. Our aim here is to have draft goals and policies for the public to review in March. That's our target right now. And that will accompany with a 30-day public comment period and meetings at our planning commission and with our board of county commissioners. So we'll gather the feedback we receive on those draft goals and policies, and we'll do some revisions. And that's all kind of working toward having a complete full chapter, if you will, of the climate sub-element ready for public to review in the late summer timeframe. And again, when it's released in the summer, you'll have another opportunity to comment. We'll go back and revise before presenting the final to the board in the fall. It's a rough timeline. To address your question about the greenhouse gas elements, so the climate funding we received was not enough to do both in this round, and the Board of County Commissioners asked us, the climate sub-element, we haven't done much climate planning at all as a county, I'll say, so as a starting place, we're behind. So this climate sub-element is a big lift for the county, and the Board of County Commissioners recognized that and asked us to invest in creating this element during this comp plan update. We were not directed to do the greenhouse gas element this time around. So that's the direction we've received, and that's the way we're moving forward. But I am happy to open it up and answer any questions you all have about either content today or process moving forward.
I want to thank you for this process. I feel like this was the first experience of being involved in comprehensive planning where I really felt like I got to hear both aligned and contradictory perspectives in a way that humanized my neighbors and allowed me to feel heard. And I just feel like if every process, let me back up. If every element could involve a participation process that was this robust, I would feel really confident about our process and outcomes. And I'm really curious about being able to be an audience member witnessing a conversation like this one. Because I know I got to put my voice in the room a lot in these workshops. I also think there are conversations where I wouldn't be the person at the table, but I would love to witness this kind of discussion on other issues. So I just hope you'll consider using this as a model for engaging around other elements.
Yeah, I'll respond that, in some of the elements that are brand new elements, we are doing more robust outreach, right? We have to develop a brand new element from scratch. That's a huge lift. And the state has given us kind of two main mandates in this comprehensive plan update: climate and housing. And so we're laser focused. My team is on those two topics. And so I think you're going to see a lot more robust outreach around those topics. And some of the other comprehensive plan elements that exist will get updates and we'll have public outreach, but probably not to this level just because of capacity.
I would like to echo that first. I have very much enjoyed this process and feel as though we develop skills in addition to sharing. The shore friendly program that provides training for our shoreline. And one of the strategies that has been featured in our training is to actually move a house. It never would have crossed my mind to be an option. But the more I hear the presentation, the more I appreciate it as a conservation of materials, the efficient way to rehouse someone. It only takes a couple of days to move a house. And it once it's all, but once it begins to roll, it's just amazing. And I would just like to throw that into the pot as another set of strategies that might be available.
Yes.
Well, I would like to second both of those comments and applaud everyone here for participating in what is essentially a citizen assembly kind of format, which has been proven to be very effective in influencing policy. I have long history as a climate and environmental justice advocate and activist, primarily because of my background in healthcare. And I see our climate and environment as essential to our health and well-being. Help, just to give you a little background, to help establish the green team at our own hospital. And I was a member of the Sustainable Whitby Coalition, which preceded some of the things that we were working on here. What I failed to hear in the 2 sessions I attended regarding public health was the mental health. We really need to get on board and recognize consequences of climate chaos on our mental health, especially on our youth. Several years ago, my wife and I attended a workshop in Portland by the International Transformational Resilience Coalition. I'm also really happy to hear that resilience is being adopted, not just gaining traction. And one of the things that they were all about was developing a database of resources, maintaining emotional and spiritual health. So I offer that to add to your list of resources. For instance, we know that, especially as a physical therapist, right? Physical activity improves emotional and spiritual well-being. So we're encouraging people, if I can walk, both reduces greenhouse gas emissions, makes you more resilient. So just wanted to add that. I really think that you listen, the school need to address this, right, directly. We know that children are concerned, deeply concerned. I'm deeply concerned that our schools are not directly addressing their concerns.
Thank you.
I create this little public service announcement. Thank you for bringing up mental health, and we think about it all the time as we talk about these impacts and everything we're talking about. As a public service announcement, the CDC has an excellent web page on climate and mental health. It is dedicated to the mental health of folks on climate change. And if anybody needs any resources or you feel kind of down or out, like definitely visit there or figure out a way. As practitioners, where we've been doing this, we do have our own kind of professional resources for that, which is kind of interesting. I want to bring that out that we, as we do this, we have professional networks where there are folks that we talk, meet, and have sessions about very important. You can ask my wife and my friends. I'll be talking about this stuff like at nauseam because it does help. And I think talking amongst yourself in the way we set your workshops helps with that a lot too. But I really appreciate you bringing that up. We don't talk. It's touchy for mental health is a professional thing, and it's it's very unique to your personality. But we do recognize that these things we're talking about are emotionally driven. It can be emotionally driven, and we do work a lot with indigenous tribes, and that it's even more so for them because it's cultures and things. Even though you all lose part of your culture. So thank you for bringing that up, and I appreciate all your early work. Recognize some of the stuff you talked about, like But,
Perfect. Okay, here we go. Comprehensive plan for 20 years is really intended improvements. And that even seems to be too long. So several things that I heard and I attended all these sessions. I would ask that from our parametrics people, help us identify what is imminent that has to be addressed. And we can't wait 10 years. Help us to turn this county around to be more proactive. we can't ignore historic data, but that doesn't help us with the predictions of 5 and 10, much less 20 years out. And one of the things that was brought up, a resilience director who is empowered and equal to the other directors can only help our elected officials do something that may not be as popular for elected officials to do. And then one comment, I was very concerned about the groundwater element because precipitation is one of the effects of groundwater. But groundwater, everybody in the room had to do with our available well access. It didn't have to do with precipitation, which is where you started. And so I would ask you to turn that one upside down and listen to the input from the other day. Groundwater discussions don't start with precipitation. Groundwater discussions start with our aquifers. And all of the things that influence it, like precipitation, that's going to occur in shorter months while we have more months of dry spell. So your prediction around how precipitation is going to change is very important. But groundwater is not aquifers. And so I would ask you to think about turning that one upside down from where you started and to where the group ended up. With so many comments about.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
If I'd like to respond, there's a couple of different comments during the sessions about comprehensive planning and the 10-year and 20-year, and it is very confusing, and I just wanted to put in my 2 cents about how I view the state's requirements around comprehensive planning. So our comprehensive plans are 20-year plans. We're supposed to project out 20 years of growth and plan for a 20-year period, and we update them every 10 years. And it's supposed to be a periodic update to check in on how are we doing. So we're not supposed to accomplish everything in our comprehensive plan in the 10-year period. I heard several comments of people of, oh, well, we haven't accomplished the things in our 2016 plan. How are we going to have any confidence you're going to address the things in this plan? We're not meant to accomplish everything in that plan. And it is a great opportunity at the 10-year check-in to say, are the things in the plan we haven't accomplished still priorities? And if so, why haven't we accomplished them? And how can we change, modify them, and build on them to make them a priority, fund them, get them into the hopper? So this is our chance. If you see things that are not done, let's not point and say you didn't do it. Let's say, why haven't we done it? And get our leaders invested in making that a priority this time around. Because I think this is our opportunity to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Emily. I think it's so important to note that we may not be 20 years down the line where we thought we wanted to get to in 2016, but we are 10 years into making policies that match the vision laid out in that 2016 plan. And so I think a big question for our community right now is, do the policies and ordinances that we have right now actually create the world we described in our vision in 2016? Because the gap between what we said we're going for and what our policies actually incentivize is a gap that we'd be well served to try to close in this coming 2 years, where this is the comprehensive planning year and next year is the updates to policy and ordinances.
And that's what we're here to address is
thank you.
How do we adjust our vision too, right? How has our vision changed? Yeah, with the latest science and information. So it's great.
I also want to thank you for holding these. It has given a focus for the Marine Resources Committee to really come together and make suggestions. And I'm going to give you, copies of stuff that I referenced. I think that when you have lots of people at the table, we really can start to appreciate all of the nuances. And maybe come together on some solutions. So I hope that occurs in the comprehensive plan. That there are some things that we can all agree on.
And thank you, Lindsay, for being at the table with us. I just think really, 20 years from now, I might be looking at retirement, but you'll be like mid-career professional trying to handle all this. So it's so nice to have a younger person present, and I just thank you for being involved. I hope you stay involved in public processes. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah, one day this is gonna be yours. Adding my thanks to, thank you. Participated and working.
Anything else, Judy?
I just wanted to level of the input and all the ideas. One of the things that I don't feel is being adequately discussed is the cost. And the number one barrier we tend to encounter when it comes to government officials, whether it be federal, state, or local, is that's a great idea. How are you? So I really feel like that needs to be mentioned. I don't have a solution. I would personally love to have everything run off of, for example, solar panels. Do you know how costly it is? It's ridiculous how expensive it is. I've got clients that are building houses. They're paying between $400 and $550 a square foot. It is very expensive. And so how do we come up with the money and incentives? We're not going to have it. You know, give you a tax incentive, that does not make up for the upfront cost. And the long term, yes, is what's important in this at the end of the day. But it's not going to get us there in the first place. If that makes sense.
Thank you for adding that.
Something that did come up in our last session, I don't know if you were present, but the suggestion that the county have a full-time grant writer so that at least the publicly funded projects could receive financial support from federal and state sources.
Which again, it's a cost issue because we've got to pay that grant writer the salary, which then puts us into that never-ending loop of, well, do we hire someone to write a grant for their own salary?
I mean, I'm working in the nonprofit sector where it's pretty typical for grant application to include an allowance of 10 or 15% for operational costs to support the program. So I just think, I agree that costs can be a barrier, and I don't think we should shut the door on good ideas without exploring ways to get access to the incredible amount of federal and state funding for climate resilience.
Great. We're getting quiet. I think that's the end. So thank you all very much.